I'm very lucky. I've worked with the same editor for almost 30 years now, and she has never yet written WTF in the margin. But I did worry a little bit that she was going to write that.
Did she?
No, I thought she was going to say, why are we in Stone Age Island? All of a sudden, I don't understand what's going on here. But luckily she didn't. She was very supportive.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cassie Davis. I'm the director of events at Harvard Bookstore, and on behalf of the store, I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's event with Maggie O'Farrell. Maggie O'Farrell came all the way from Edinburgh to be with us tonight. Her novels include The Marriage Portrait, After You've Gone, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, The Hand That First Held Mine, Instructions for a Heatwave, perfect timing for that one, the memoir I Am, and of course, the #1 best-selling novel Hamnet, which was winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Women's Prize for Fiction. O'Farrell also co-wrote the screenplay for the Oscar-winning movie. Her new novel, Land, which came out earlier this month, is a New York Times bestseller and a soaring historical novel set in Ireland in the years before and after the Great Hunger. Joining O'Farrell on stage tonight is Celeste Ng, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of the novels Everything I Never Told You, Little Fires Everywhere, and Our Missing Hearts. Now please join me in welcoming Maggie O'Farrell and Celeste Ng.
Hi. Thank you all so much for coming. I have to admit, we were so busy chatting backstage that we almost missed our cue to come out. But thank you all for being here. And Maggie, welcome to Cambridge.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a kind of a proper serious church.
Is it? I think they do services here during the week, right? Yes. So they do services, and then they've actually got like a shelter, and they've got all kinds of things. So they are very much part of the community, which feels like a nice way to welcome you here. To start off, congratulations on this beautiful novel. I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about, what the novel is about, how it came to you, and then maybe we can ask you to do a reading in a minute.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. So my new novel is called Land, and on one hand, it's a story of a family who are in Ireland in the 19th century who are trying to come out from under the great shadow of the Great Hunger, or Angor, the Great Famine in Ireland. But on the other hand, I wanted to try and tell the whole story of the country of Ireland just via one peninsula in the west coast and all the people who've lived upon it. And it came to me, it's funny, it's a novel that I wanted to write for a really long time. I don't know if you find this, Celeste, but there are some novels that seem to descend upon you like lightning. And there are others which are a really slow burn, and you have different strands, and sometimes over decades, they gradually weave themselves together until at one point you think, oh, I see, it's a novel. It's not just a loose collection of things that I'm interested in.
It's not just that little kind of thing you keep taking out and then putting back in. Take it out. Nope, not today. Put away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or it tends to kind of coalesce like a cloud, a good cloud, not a storm cloud. So there were all these things that I was interested in, and then one day I was on a train going from Belfast to Dublin, and I was just staring out at the landscape, and this sentence came into my head, and it was, his father was ever a man of few words. And it was almost as if I recognized it. And I thought, I know what that is. That's the first line of that novel I've been thinking about. And I wish it happened more often like that, actually. It doesn't. So and on the train, it was like a kind of key. It was like a finding key or finding a map, appropriately enough. And I could somehow see the path and the way forward into the novel. So maybe I will read some.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful.
It's a bit of a juggle with a book and a microphone and some glasses. So you have to bear with me. My teenagers hate these glasses. They say I look like the woman in The Incredibles.
But she's the best one.
Exactly, that's what I say.
She's
I'm owning
the one that makes the super suits.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm actually really proud of that. Anyway, back to the novel. So this is a point at which the novel starts with a father and a son mapping team who are working. My glasses are steaming up now. Who are working on surveying a peninsula in the west coast of Ireland. And the father, Tomas, loves the work, and his son Liam does not. And they find a scrap of ancient woodland which doesn't appear on the map, and so they go into it with the intention of surveying it, but in that copse they have a very unsettling experience which changes the course of all their lives. And at this point in the book, Tomas has moved the whole family, his wife and all three of his children at this point, to live on the peninsula. And his wife, Fina, has just arrived, and she's really unimpressed by the accommodation that he's provided, and she's walked away. Right, we'll try again with the glasses. When Tomas returns down to the shore, he finds his children at play. Enda has Rose on her back, with Rose's hands over her eyes, and Liam is leading them around and around the widow's house. Inside, Fina and the widow are standing over a steaming laundry pot, laughing at something, their 4 hands employed in scrubbing. There is a general air of mutual approval, of female complicity. He glances at the long table, then away, feeling oddly wrong-footed, for he had expected to find Fina sitting forlornly by the cart in the rain, surrounded by miserable children, grateful that he'd returned, in a perhaps more pliant frame of mind. He had not counted on this situation, Fina finding a friend and a place at the widow's side. I thought, Tomas began, that if we fixed up a sheet from the gable wall, then... The 2 women look up with identical, scornful gazes. I'll not go back, Fina says. What? He says, astonished, but we agreed. We did not agree, Fina says, wringing out a cloth, twisting it into a rope between her hands. Far from it. You took the money without telling me. You said there was a house for us. That, she points in the direction of the hill, is not a house. I will not live in an eviction ruin. How could you ask me to do such a thing? I'll not have this baby on a hillside. I will not. All right, he cuts across her testily. If I mend it, if I put on a roof. Fina seems to consider this. She slaps the wet, steaming garment back into the water. Tomas is sure he sees the widow mutter something to her from the corner of her mouth. Fina gives her an answering flex of her eyebrow. There must be a roof, she says, pointing at him in a way he has never seen before, one hand on his hip. Windows, a door, a proper floor, a clean chimney that draws the smoke, and, she says, delivering her trump card, you're to go back to making maps for the redcoats. Tomas is aghast. Never, he says heatedly, shifting from foot to foot. I will never do that again. I told you. I'll not take their money. I'll not be in their pay, in their... Then I will not live in that place, and neither will the children. Tomas grips at his jacket cuffs with tense hands. He glances from one woman to the other and sees that they have cooked up these terms between them. Why did he ever let her come down here on her own? Why hadn't he followed her when she walked off? Come away outside, he said gruffly. Just the 2 of us, and we'll talk this over. Oh, she murmurs. Now you want to talk. The widow bows her head as if to hide a smile, and Tomas cannot believe that this alliance has been formed so swiftly, so completely in the time he was up the hill. How do women do that? Fina lifts her chin, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and advances upon him. Listen to me, Tomas, she says, in a soft and to him menacing voice. I know you want this life with your own land, your own little house, beholden to no one. But that is not really how things are, is it? We will still be beholden to the Viscount because we'll owe him rent every single month, and we'll be at the mercy of the land, all its ups and downs, and we, she circles a hand to include him, herself, the widow, know only too well how that can end. I will not let my children go hungry. I will not be turfed out of my home. You may fix the cottage, you may sow your crops, you may keep a cow, and I will milk it for you, but I will only live here on this peninsula if you continue to bring in those wages. If you won't do that, I will not stay. Tomas stares at his wife, so diminutive and determined, her belly pushed out with their unborn child. He opens his mouth to speak, then closes it again. He removes the scarf from around his neck and, for want of anything better to do, throws it down on the table. Fina gives her husband a final nod. A roof, she says, a hearth, a chimney, and you working on the maps. Then, she finishes, turning back to the laundry, we'll see. Thank you very much.
Oh, there's so much to talk about with this novel. I almost don't know where to start. We'll start with this passage that you began with. There's this tension between Tomas wanting to go out, have this sort of life that he envisions on the peninsula because of the experience that he had in this at this spring, which I won't ruin for anyone who hasn't read it. But then there's also this condition that Fina, his wife, gives him, which is that you have to go back to making maps for the redcoats, right? And that brings up so many of the issues that for me ran through the book, the questions of, whose land is it? What does it mean to make a map? What does it mean to put these, what names do you put down on it? Did you know from the beginning that was going to be part of the book? Was that something that came in, or, how much of the lightning flash hit you on that train?
Well, I think I always knew the book was going to be centered around mapping, because it's actually based on someone real, my great-great-grandfather. We were told as children that, well, actually I heard it as a child, that one of our antecedents had drawn the first ever map of Ireland. That's the story that I kind of internalized as a child. Obviously, it's completely untrue. But when when I was a child, this was the kind of family myth that sort of circulated around us. And I was very sort of attached to this this forebear of mine. And as you maybe can tell, I was born in Ireland, but I didn't grow up there. I left when we were quite young. We left when I was quite young. And but we used to go back a lot. And when we were there in the summer, I used to look out of the window and I used to imagine him. And I think I based him visually probably on TV period dramas, because he was definitely wearing a frock coat. And I'm sure there was some kind of cravat involved, maybe even a top hat. But also he was carrying, to my very childish mind, my school issue ruler, which is about, I don't know if you guys work in centimetres, about 30 centimetres, because obviously that's how you measure a whole country. But he's always been someone that intrigued me. And quite more recently, when I was obviously a bit more grown up and I realised that this was all quite fantasy, I wanted to go and find out how much truth there was to this family myth, because I do think, and I think a lot of the novel is about the seeds of truth that occur in folklore and myth. Mm-hmm. So I went to the archives in Dublin, and the Dublin archives hold the records of the British Ordnance Survey, which was commissioned by the British government and run by the British Army, and it was to survey and map the whole of Ireland. And he was quite hard to find, because the British Ordnance Survey had a ruling that if you were Irish and you worked for them, you weren't allowed to sign your own work. It had to be signed by a British Army officer. So I knew that in this archive were probably lots of his field notes, his draft maps, his sketches, his measurements, but I couldn't identify which of his they were. But I did find his signature on certain administrative memorandum that were circulated to labourers, as he was called. And that was really amazing. Finding his signature, you get it's partly a kind of archival thrill that that you're touching a piece of paper.
Yeah, you're like, oh, it's real. You touched this and I touched it now.
Yeah, there's that amazing thrill that the kind of time has collapsed down. But also, it was proof that there was a truth in the family myth.
Yeah, which is kind of an amazing thing. There's myths almost never come out of nowhere, right? And for me, that was one of the themes of the book also, of how a story happens, but then it gets passed on, and what kind of stays, what trinkets or what nuggets of truth kind of get passed along. And maybe we'll come back to that in a second. But there's a moment in which the characters are talking about the maps as almost a form of resistance, and the idea that maybe if you wrote the map a different way, maybe you could show the country a different way, you might get something truer than that of the power that's colonized you. There's a beautiful quote that Tomas says, where he says, "There needs to be a map of how this land really is, of how it has always been, of what lies beneath whatever order or disorder others might impose upon it. There must be a way to create such a document, and to do so would be an act of honor and resistance." I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea of resistance as it relates to maps, as it relates to language, as it relates to place, because in Irish history, that's a very, very potent theme.
Well, I knew that if I was going to choose to write a novel about Ireland in the 19th century, that there are certain things that you can't shy away from. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Great Famine is one, because there it sits right in the middle of the century like a dark storm cloud. But also, you can't not talk about occupation and colonialism and ownership of land. I always knew the novel needed to be called Land because it's such a potent word and such a potent concept, particularly in Ireland. Who owns the land? Who's it belong to? What is it called? All these issues are not straightforward, and they carry an awful lot of history with them. So I suppose I got very kind of interested in mapping and the act of mapping and what it means and what it means to do it. And I think when I went to the archives and I I realised that my great-great-grandfather had started work on the second revision of the Ordnance Survey map of Ireland in what was the later years of the Great Famine. And that date really struck me because, I just thought, what on earth must that job have been like? What must that task have been like to be setting down cartographically what occurred in those years? Because, obviously, as I'm sure many of you know, 1 million people died during the Great Famine, and between 1 million and 2 million people were had to emigrate. And so Ireland lost a third of its population in about 4 or 5 years. And so obviously, there were many ramifications of this, but one of them was, geographically, the human and physical geography of Ireland completely changed in those years. Whole villages were wiped out, estates were redrawn, land was redistributed and reused. And, obviously a lot of people had been buried. So it was necessary to start revising the map almost immediately. And that was the work that he was doing. And I do think, I think often in creative writing workshops, you're told to write what you know. But I feel that sometimes you have to write what you don't know or what you don't understand, or if you're left with a question. And after I had been through the archives and read a lot about the Great Famine, I think I was just left with 2 questions, really, which in a sense drove the book. One of which was, how could something of this magnitude have happened so close to one of the richest empires in the world? And also, what on earth must that task have been like for my great-great-grandfather to be of that country and making those changes on the maps?
Yeah, it's fascinating. As you probably know, Boston has a lot of ties to Ireland because of the Great Hunger. Actually, just out on Cambridge Common, just over there, there's a statue that was put up, I think, in the late 90s, memorializing the links between Boston and Ireland, the Great Hunger. And so there's a statue of a woman who's holding out bread to someone who's kneeling down and getting it. And so I imagine a lot of people here have a particular personal interest in that. And the details that you have in the novel are so vivid because you've got characters who are mapping the after effects of it. All these people, there used to be 11 children in this house and they're all gone, right? And then also the people who have lived through it and who have memories of that they're carrying around with them that they maybe don't want to talk about. How much of that did you know already? How much of that did you have to sort of unearth and find those details? As they feel so real that I want to believe as a writer that there are those things that you find in history and you're like, suddenly this scene came to life. How did you go about sort of putting those scenes together?
Well, I did have a huge amount of vertigo and trepidation writing about the Great Famine. The critic Terry Eagleton says that the Great Famine pushes us to the limit of the inarticulable. But again, I suppose it goes back to what I was saying, that you can't not write about it if you're going to choose to write about Ireland in the 19th century. You can't really shy away from it. And, most of the novel is about the recovery and people carrying on and picking themselves up and developing resilience. And, and that was what I was interested in. Most of the history books written about the Great Famine, and rightly so, focus on the people who died. And I think also the narrative of people who chose or were forced to emigrate is quite familiar to us. That seems to me there's an awful lot of history books and also fiction films about that story. But I think what I was interested in focusing on in this novel is the people who survived but stayed.
Yeah, and who chose to stay.
Yeah, and how Ireland picked itself up and carried on. I think it's an incredibly resilient country. I mean, I think it's had to have been. But so I did, but there are some scenes which do take place in those terrible years, and it was really important to me to base all those scenes as closely as I could on first-hand accounts.
Yeah. You talked about how sometimes you need to write what you don't know, which is actually where I start writing as well. It's always where I'm confused about why someone would do something, how they did it. You mentioned, too, that you were born in Ireland and you've gone back and forth, but that you don't live there and you didn't grow up there continuously. Do you feel like that shaped how you look at the country, at Irish history, about how you choose to write about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't think I could ever and would ever write a novel set in contemporary Ireland just because I couldn't, and it wouldn't feel right and accurate because I don't live there and I haven't lived there for a very long time. But, and I did worry, I did worry a little bit about whether I was Irish enough to write this book. Yeah. It was something that I thought about. My cousins call me Irish adjacent, which I think is quite funny. But I think these are my Irish cousins. But I think, I think there is always this, it's a very, very important part of who I am and my heritage. My Irish heritage is very important to me. And ever since Brexit, I've clung ever more proudly to my Irish passport. But I do think it's, and I'm sure it's something that many of the people in this room share, the sense that if you don't grow up where you were born, or if your passport doesn't, as in my case, match your accent, there's always a kind of sense of a kind of doppelganger, I think, or a ghost self that walks along beside you always, because you always have half an eye, I think, on who you might have been if we'd stayed, or who would I have been different? I would have sounded completely different. I'd have had a Derry accent, which is quite exciting, isn't it?
That's right. I sympathize with that greatly. I think about that quite a lot. We were chatting backstage about how my family comes from Hong Kong, and you'd spent some time there, and of course, Hong Kong is also a place, like Ireland, like many other places, that has a history of being colonized by Britain. And I do think a lot about, if my family had stayed rather than immigrating over to the US, or if the Opium War had never happened and Hong Kong had never been handed over to the British, how so many things would be different. And your comment about the doppelganger actually brings up something that I was wondering myself as a reader and a writer, which is that I've noticed in many of your books, there is a sort of theme of doubling, of people who, brother and sister, one, can be almost mistaken for the other. One will take the place of the other. That happens in Hamnet, that happens in this book to a certain extent. There's a sense in which there is sort of a ghost self. Sometimes it's made real in your family, or sometimes it's a memory of someone else. And I was curious about what drew you to that theme, but maybe you've already answered this question.
No one's ever asked me that before, Celeste. Must be, actually. I don't know. It's an interesting idea, I think, I suppose you might call it a kind of sliding doors moment. I often think that a lot of fiction can also come from a place of the writer imagining the road not taken.
Yeah.
I think that often happens in all kinds of fiction. You think, this is the life I have and this is the one I chose, but I could very easily have had that life.
I think that's really true. And I think maybe that's inherent in part of what we do as fiction writers, because we are sort of always asking, well, what if, right? We are always kind of imagining, well, if it was a little different. I have a fiction writer friend who refers to fiction writing as life editing, she calls it, because she's like, you can kind of change things around to make them the way that you feel like they should have been. We've talked a lot about the Great Hunger, and then also that this is the family sort of chose to stay and actually chose to go back to the land and to make their home there. But there's actually, the scope of this book is sort of breathtaking. It jumps in time. We start in 1865, and then we actually go back and cover quite a lot of periods of Irish history, go back to 1865, and then we continue from there. Sort of this dizzying whirlwind that I got swept along with as I was going. How did you figure out the structure of the book? How did you decide that you were going to go back and look at what had happened in the land before this family, and everything that had kind of led up to that moment that we see at the very beginning of the book?
Well, I think I always knew from that moment on the train that I wanted, as I said at the beginning, this to also be a story about the whole of Ireland. Sort of to tell the whole history of it, the whole story of it, and all its many, many permutations and occupations. And I think I'd planned that the book is in 4 parts, and I knew that the second part was going to begin with it's quite a brief chapter, and it goes right back to Stone Age Ireland. It goes right back to the very first inhabitant of that peninsula. And I really enjoyed writing it. I loved doing it, but I was a little bit worried when I handed it in to my editor, because I've worked with the same editor. I'm very lucky. I've worked with the same editor for almost 30 years now, and she has never yet written WTF in the margin, but I did worry a little bit that she was going to write that.
Did she?
No, I thought she was going to say, why are we in Stone Age Island? All of a sudden, I don't understand what's going on here. But luckily she didn't. She was very supportive. But I would say, and also that chapter is really inspired by one of my favourite museums. I don't know if anyone here has been to Dublin.
I was going to ask you about this. I remember going to the National Museum in Dublin.
Yes.
And you can see they've got preserved some of the bodies of the people that have been preserved from the Stone Age, basically, in the bog. And I remember I went, gosh, it was before the pandemic, but I went with my son, and I remember saying, like, okay, so we're gonna look at these people. And he kind of went in. He was, I think, 7 or 8, and he went in and he kind of looked at them for a long time, and he's like, "Are they sleeping?" Because they, in a way, you know, these are people from so long ago, and he recognized that there was still a humanness about them, and it was really moving, I found, to see them and to kind of see a person from that age. I'm now hoping that was the museum you were talking about, and not some completely different museum. Like that was not
entirely another museum. No, it is that one. So it's the National Museum of Archaeology in Dublin, and it's such an extraordinary museum in many ways. But one of the things I really love about it is that it tells the whole story of Ireland through objects, but also most of the objects aren't actually found, unlike other museums, by professional archaeologists. They're mostly found by people who've just been living on the land and cutting their turf, and they've found these extraordinary Bronze Age talks, or this jewelry or plates, or but like you said, that they also have the bog bodies, which are, well, I think they are probably the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen in my life, because you can stand, I suppose, you get this real sense of time just collapsing down like a tin can, and you're standing next to someone who lived millennia ago, and you can see their fingernails and their
hands.
eyelashes,
their hands.
and the stubble on their chin. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So anyway, this is a very long answer to your question, but so that museum was really inspirational for me for writing that chapter. There is actually one clause in the novel which goes back to the Ice Age, which I was so happy to be able to include. Because it goes all the way back. It's only a clause, don't get frightened. And my children, I don't know if your son ever calls you this, my children call me a neek. I don't know if you know that word, it's a cross between a nerd and a geek. And when I told them this, I said, it's great, I've still got the clause about the Ice Age. They all said, neek.
I'm glad to know I'm not the only one whose children, teenagers, kind of keep me firmly in my place.
Grounded.
Yes. Well, the other sort of major sort of branch of the story that I wanted to ask, there's the story of this map maker and his family, and sort of the moving on from the Great Hunger. There's the story of the whole history of Ireland as it's sort of layered down in this one portion of the land. And there's a third part, which is this sort of mysticism. As you said, they go into this spring, and they both have this sort of unsettling experience, this father and son. And that spring in that little wooded area comes up several times throughout the novel in various different forms. And I'm curious about how that found its way into the book as well.
Well, I've always been really fascinated by Ireland's sacred wells, or sacred springs, or holy wells they're called, and they are all over Ireland. There's one pretty much in every town, every settlement, every village, and to find it, you just generally have to turn up somewhere. And if there's a bookshop, I always ask the bookseller, because booksellers know everything. And if there isn't a bookshop, you can ask in the pub. Or failing that, you can just ask someone who's about 60 or 70, and they'll always be able to tell you where they are. And some of them are really well preserved, and obviously still very much part of the communities and their rituals. Some of them are beside the road, some of them are in the road, some of them are in fields. A lot of them are have been co-opted into churchyards for hundreds and thousands of years now. And they always involve some kind of really complicated rituals. You can still see people doing it. generally you do what's called making a devotion at the well, and you walk around it 7 times, and you stay a decade, and you sometimes drink the water, you sometimes give an offering, and you can ask for a cure often, or some kind of answer to a prayer. And it's so fascinating to me because these wells go right back to pre-Christian pagan Ireland, to the time of the Druids, when people generally worship things that they could see. They worship the natural world or worship water. And obviously, water is so important to burgeoning communities and farmers and people who live on the land. But I think about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was starting to write this book, I went to Ireland. I'm often in Ireland anyway, but I went to Ireland specifically with the intention of going to visit lots of these wells. And I took my son with me, who's actually always up for a weird quest. And when we were, he wasn't so impressed with the 6 a.m. flight to Knock Airport. But once we were there, he was quite into it. But on the first night when we were unpacking, he said to me, "Why have you packed secateurs?" And I said, well, because we're going to be looking for neglected wells. We're going to find the ones that have been forgotten, and they're going to be covered in brambles and bracken, so we're going to have to hack our way through to look at them. But so it was, they are extraordinary, but I was really interested recently to read that an academic had done research into the waters in these wells, and there's one in County Cork, which has been famous for thousands of years for curing madness. And this person found out that when he analysed the waters, that this particular well had really high levels of lithium, which is extraordinary, isn't it? So, those Druids were onto something.
Yeah. So now I'm really curious, when you went to the wells, did you make a devotional? Did you make an offering?
Yeah, some of them you wouldn't really want to have drunk, to be honest. I did think about it, but no, we did. There's such a huge variety of them, and I just find their continuing presence and people's continuing belief in them so interesting.
It's amazing, because I'm trying to think, do we have an equivalent of that in the U.S.? And I don't think we do. Something that has been there for so long, or if we do, it's been pushed back far enough that it's not. I don't think it's really in our public consciousness. I guess because we're in a church, I guess I have to ask you about the flip side of that. You mentioned that a lot of those springs have sort of been co-opted into the churchyards and things like that. And there's this tension in the novel as well that the book explores between sort of the more organized and dogmatic and sort of handed down colonial sort of religion and the sort of more naturalistic, spiritualistic thing. There's a character who is thinking about that idea of finding God in all things and is actually really discomfited by it, right? Finds that sort of very upsetting. And it struck me as in reading that's a very democratic way of looking at God or spirits, right? That it could be accessible to anywhere. You don't necessarily have to come to church on the day. You don't have to do the things that they tell you to. I guess there's no question in this comment, but I was thinking, was that something that you were thinking about as you went along? Did you know that you wanted the church to go into it?
Yes, obviously, we're talking about Ireland. There are certain things that you can't not write about, and obviously the church has a very important influence on Ireland. But also, I knew that it had to be in the novel because the character Liam, who you met there, the son of Tomas, who's helping him initially with the mapmaker, he's based on my great-grandfather. And one of the reasons I've always been fascinated by my great-great-grandfather, the mapper, and his son, is because the son, who's my great-grandfather, we know that he became a Jesuit at one point. And as I'm sure many of you in the room know, becoming a Jesuit is not something you kind of just drift into or you just happen to get a fancy for one day. It's, you're basically on that course, you decide on that course when you're really quite a young adult or even a child. And it takes, it's very, very difficult to be accepted for the training, and it takes years and years. So my great-grandfather, the character I call Liam, became a Jesuit, and we know, obviously, the fact that I exist and my siblings and all my cousins exist was that he left, which, it's an enormous deal in Ireland to join the church, and it's an even bigger deal, very notorious, to leave it. And we also know that after this, he went full circle and became a mapper like his father. And so that father relationship has always fascinated me. And also his trajectory in life is really fascinating. And we have in the house where I grew up, a tiny little hand-drawn map of an imaginary place, and it's drawn by Liam, my great-grandfather. And I realized only very recently that I think it's dedicated to his father, Tomas. And because in the corner there's a tiny little medallion, and I must have passed it thousands of times during my lifetime. And a couple of years ago, before I started writing this book, for some reason I decided to look at it through a magnifying glass, and I realized that the tiny medallion in the corner shows Tomas, and he's standing behind a British soldier in a red jacket, and the soldier is looking through a theodolite. And that was astonishing. I couldn't believe that this person I'd been thinking about and searching for so long had been there hiding in plain sight.
In your house.
In my house, in the house where I grew up.
I don't know if you have this
time.
thing. I love the feeling you said at the beginning where, the idea is maybe kind of gathering itself. And then I always like to think of it as it's the thing that happens when I guess there's dust in the universe and it swirls and swirls and eventually it gets enough mass that it kind of collapses in on itself and it becomes a star. But that moment where the universe, it feels like it's just handing you things to put into your book, that you're like, oh, and this'll fit and this'll fit. It's an amazing feeling. We're going to move to audience Q&A in a few minutes, so start thinking about your questions. But I just want to ask you about one or two other bits, and then I'm sure that the audience will have plenty to ask as well. One is that I wanted to talk to you about Enda, who is Liam's sister and who I just loved. She's so spunky, she's so fearless, and she ends up on this trajectory that, at least at the beginning, feels very, very different from the rest of her family. And I'm curious about how you developed her character. If she's got a counterpart in life as well, or if she was one of those ones who wrote herself into the book.
Well, I think that all four children, I think, in the novel, in different ways, are very aware of the silences that reside in their parents. So obviously their parents, Tomas and Fina, have been through terrible things and they've witnessed terrible things, and their way of dealing with it is to smother it in silence. They can't speak of it. And for me, a lot of the novel is about sort of language and silence and being silenced. And I think all four children are very aware of this, but they react to it in different ways. And Enda she's very intelligent, and when she moves to the peninsula, there is no provision for education for girls. So I always knew that she was going to need some kind of outlet. And I really wanted to write about music. So I gave her a fiddle. She becomes a fiddle player. And while I was writing this book, I did all kinds of research. A lot of it was kind of library based. Some of it was going to Ireland. Some of it was, but with I couldn't. So when I was younger, I learned how to play the piano, and I learned how to sing, so I could read music. And somehow, me writing the character of Enda, my ability to read music was kind of standing in the way. I needed to understand how you play an instrument, how you learn an instrument just by ear, by somebody singing to you or somebody, playing it to you, and you come hear it, and somehow you're able to put your fingers in the right place. And I couldn't understand how to do it. So I asked a friend of mine who's a really good fiddle player to teach me, and she did. And she lent me a fiddle and she gave me lots of lessons. But I would say that I'm not going to be bothering the folk music scene anytime soon. All I will say is that one of our cats took to sleeping on top of the fiddle box, stretched out as if to say, "You are not getting in here."
Well, that brings me to my last question before we go to the audience, which is I can't end the Q&A without asking you about the dog, or the dogs, I should say, in the book. I'm a relatively recent now dog owner. It doesn't seem like the right word. I think the dog is really more owning us at this point. But we got a dog earlier this year, and so it was a real joy to read the book and find so many dogs in there. And I actually think that writing animals may be one of the hardest things to do, harder even than writing children, because they don't have the same language that we have, right? How did you go about getting into the dog's perspective, and what made you decide to go into that dog's perspective?
Well, I have to say, it's just one of the really good things about being a novelist. There are many, but one of the good things is that you get to kind of live another life and you get to have a wish fulfillment. So I've always really wanted an Irish wolfhound, but they're not the most convenient dogs to have. So I've still...
They're so pretty.
I know they are beautiful. My sister's promised she's going to get one, so I'm going to borrow hers. That's my plan. But anyway, so what I could do is have one in the novel, or several actually, as it turns out. But I think the reason why the dog is there is because it was very important to me to try and bring as much of Irish folklore as I could into the novel. And I mean the kind of, not so much the actual incidents and stories, but the kind of narrative rules on the tropes and the hermetic world of Irish folklore. So my father is one of those immigrants who's never quite got over leaving Ireland. I think he still thinks he's going to go back. And we have to say, Dad, you're 86. It's probably not going to happen. But when we were children, he would only ever read Irish folklore to us and Irish myth. We would beg him to read us, where the wild things are, but he'd always say, nope, these are the only stories you ever have to know. So the kind of rules of the world in Irish folklore are so specific. And of course, the natural world, the landscape, is the absolute supreme power in these stories. And animals probably come second and humans a very low third. And the landscape, the natural world can control the action. It can change things, and it's very, you have to respect it in Irish myth. So if you ever find yourself in an Irish myth and you're told not to cross a river or not to cut a branch from that bush, don't do it, because something really bad will happen to you. So it was very important to me to have as much of that atmosphere and those tropes in this novel as well.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry, I should say there were lots of dogs in Irish myth and fish.
All right, we'll take some questions from the audience. We've got Maggie wandering here, taking questions. Great, and then we'll come over there afterwards.
Should I just sit up? First of all, I'm honored to be able to see both of you. And Celeste, I really love Little Fires Everywhere, too.
Thank you.
So my question for Maggie is, I think about places like Palestine or Lebanon or Sudan right now, or I'm a trauma survivor if I want to write my own story. I don't know how I would become objective enough to write the story, and I wonder how you did that. Like, get enough distance so that you're not emotional about it, all the injustice, but yet you can still bring it into the story.
I think objectivity is overrated. I think, why not get emotional? Why not get upset? If these things upset you, be upset. Write them down. It's good, very good fuel. And I get really upset when I write sad things, and I get really happy when I write happy things. I think objectivity is overrated. Go for it.
Nice.
Hi. Irish history is full of stories of emigration. But is there a thread, and I haven't read it yet, sorry, of immigration into Ireland, the change of the land from people moving in, and any thoughts on that in this book, or your personal thoughts on that in today's environment?
Well, yes. I mean, you can't really write about Ireland if you're not going to discuss emigration and immigration. One of the things another thing actually that spurred me on, we were talking about things, the dust and particles. One of the things that really made me want to write this book was I read a headline or an article in an Irish newspaper, and I think it was 2021 or 2022, and it said that only that year had the population of Ireland returned to pre-famine levels. It had taken that long, 170 years, for just the population to recover. And that was mainly down to immigration. So it's just one really, really small aspect of that kind of very slow recovery. But there is a very strong strand of emigration in the book, but I can't really say it would be too much of a spoiler to go any further than that. But thank you for your question.
Hi. So I have a question about the story in Land, and I promise it's not a spoiler, but it's about the voice at the well, and especially given your comment you just made about the hierarchy of animal, land, and humans. Who is speaking at the well? Is it the fish, or the well, or her father?
I think it really would be a spoiler for me to say, actually. So I can't tell you. But it's a very good question. But I'm afraid I'd have to kill everyone, and that would be awful.
Hi. I think you were talking about kind of the themes in the book And I was thinking this kind of reminds me of like translations by Brian Friel. I'm going to butcher the last name. You talk about language and culture and all these things. And my family's from Ireland for years. Not me, obviously. You can hear that I'm aggressively not that. But is there also an element to language? Because I know we were talking a lot about place and land itself, but is there also a place for language itself? Like, we're talking about place names and things like that. Is there also something thematically about the actual place names in your story as well?
Yes, I mean, I love that play, Translations by Brian Friel, and I love the way particularly he uses language, the way that the British mappers are replacing the Irish place names with the English language as a kind of metaphor for colonialism. There is quite a lot of discussion of language and place names in the novel, partly because when I went to the archives, I could literally see the translations that they were doing, and that's one of the main reasons why men like my great-great-grandfather were employed, so that the British surveyors and army officers could communicate with local people, because when they began doing the first map in 1820, they estimated that it was going to take them 7 years to map Ireland. It actually took them 22 partly because they refused to employ any Irish people at first, which didn't work out very well for them, because obviously the language and the naming and the ownership of land is so complicated in Ireland, there's been so many different occupiers and so many different, the plantation system originated in Ireland. It's very, and they couldn't understand why people on one side of a mountain had one name for it and people on the other side had another name for it. And nobody could communicate. I also have read that one of the reasons was that when, obviously, local people were quite alarmed when a large army division rolled into town, and they also quite very correctly divined that it was to do with taxation. And so the British surveyors would spend days, sometimes weeks, setting up the trig point, which is the sort of geographical point, usually on a hill, where accurate measurement is very necessary to have it exactly right so that accurate measurements can be made. So they would spend weeks setting it up, and then sometimes during the night, the locals would just move it a few feet just to mess with them. So that's why it took them 22 years.
Hello, I was blown away by Hamnet. I really, truly loved the book. And one thing it's obviously a historical novel, and obviously this is a historical novel too, but I was really struck by your choice to write in the present tense in a historical novel. And I was wondering what made you decide to write in the present tense. It sounds like from your reading that you did it again this time. So just curious about that choice.
Well, it's funny, I often leave decisions like that to do with grammar and case up to what I think of as kind of the instinctive part of my head, or actually what Rudyard Kipling described as the wrong side of his head. I always think that in some ways stories or narratives or novels will tell you what it is they need in a way. And I think, I actually was once writing a book which is called The Hand That First Tell Mine, and I started it in the first person present tense, as in I sit, I talk. And I got about 10,000 words in, and I kept noticing that every day when I sat down to start writing, I would automatically start in the third person past tense, as in she sat, she talked. And after a while, I thought, I don't understand, why is this happening? And so I printed it out, and I read it, and I thought, actually, you know what, my instinct is right. So I had to spend a really, really dull fortnight changing every I to she and every eat to ate. Because I think in a way you only know what you're doing when you're actually doing it. But I think the reason why I wanted particularly to write Hamnet and land actually in the present tense is because I think particularly with Hamnet and the book I wrote after, The Marriage Portrait, which are both set in the 16th century, it's a big step for us in this present world to inhabit those people and to really be inside their skin and think about what it is they need and want. But somehow the present tense brings them even closer, or it did bring them closer to me as a writer, and I was hoping maybe it would have that effect on the reader it just kind of helps. I suppose it goes back to what I was saying, it collapses down time between us and them.
We have time for one more question.
I think it's really great that you base so much of this in your personal history. It's always fun to delve into the genealogy. And I was just curious if there were any sort of fun tidbits you found along the way about your own personal history that you'd like to share.
I don't know. That sounds very personal. I mean, I've written a memoir. You could always go and read that if you really want. Just saying.
Yeah.
I don't know, actually. That's made my mind go blank.
I was going to ask, were there any bits that you found that you wanted to work in and you couldn't fit them in, that are going to become the seeds for the next novel in the future? I know that's not what you're asking.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are always bits, I think you start off with an idea and there are always going to be alleyways that you go down that you have to end up cutting. I always think that the life of a writer, sometimes a good day is writing 2,000 words. Sometimes the best day you can have is cutting 4,000 words. So, you never quite know. I grow a lot of succulents and, often leaves fall off succulents, and if you plant them, they'll grow a whole new plant. I think novels are a bit like that as well. Sometimes there's a chapter you think this doesn't work, but actually maybe if I could replant it and it'll grow something else.
Or if you leave it sit for a little bit, it'll start growing little roots. It's wonderful. Maggie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.